Hi, I'm Lynn Blend. I'm a drag queen, a Vtuber, and a true crime enthusiast, and today I'll be doing a deep dive into the crimes of H.H. Holmes, who is widely considered to be America's first serial killer. The legend that's been built up around him in the over a century since his death leaves it very difficult to find the facts of this case, since it's rumored he could have killed up to 200 people. Holmes is also a notoriously unreliable source about his own crimes. He even listed victims in his confession that later turned out to be alive and well. I've tried to confirm anything that I talk about in this video through multiple sources, but it's entirely possible and, let's be honest, probable that I'll get something wrong. I'm trying my best though. Before we get started, I want you to be aware this video will contain discussions of Holmes' violent acts against animals, women, and children, and we'll also briefly go over his childhood history of parental abuse and bullying in school. So please use your discretion, prioritize your mental health, take care of yourselves. H.H. Holmes was born on May 16th, 1861. He was born into a wealthy family, but had a troubled home life. His father was an abusive alcoholic, and his mother was a strict Methodist. He also had a difficult time in school as well as at home and was bullied regularly. In one incident, his bullies made him touch a skeleton, and from then on it seems like he had a fascination with death and corpses. So since this incident, Holmes expressed an interest in medicine and surgery, and unfortunately, like many serial killers as children, he started with animal cruelty, and as a kid and a teen he would practice surgeries by killing and dissecting animals. As an adult, he would enroll in the University of Michigan as a medical student and thus move on to practicing on human corpses. He would steal cadavers from the medical school to perform experiments on them. And it's during this time that another pattern that would continue throughout Holmes's life would emerge, and that is running insurance scams. So he would use these stolen cadavers to commit life insurance fraud. In 1885, Holmes moved to Chicago, and he found a job in a pharmacy, and eventually took over the business after the former owner's death. Now, some sources say that the original owner died of natural causes. Some say that Holmes could have killed him. We'll most likely never know. Soon after this, though, he would begin the construction on the house that would become a huge part of how he is remembered today. This house later became known as the Murder Castle, and the house was 3 stories, contained Holmes's living quarters on the upper floors, as well as rooms that were specifically for trapping, torturing, and killing his victims. He even had body chutes that he would use to transport his victims' remains to the basement, where he would dispose of them by cremating them in a kiln. Now, Holmes would lure his victims to the castle in a few different ways. Sometimes he would get engaged to a woman in order to get control of her finances. At the end of the day, a lot of these murders are going to be motivated by money. A lot of scams, a lot of insurance scams. Once he would gain control of a woman's money, she would suddenly disappear. Sometimes his victims would be lured there with the promise of a job, and once they were employed, they would be forced to sign generous life insurance policies listing him as the beneficiary, only to never be seen again. He would also make his money by selling the corpses of some of his victims to medical schools. It's hard to know exactly how many victims there actually were, but I'm going to go over some of the people that are assumed to have been killed by H.H. Holmes. Once the castle was searched, bones found in the basement were linked to a young girl named Pearl Connor, though not confirmed to be her. Both Pearl and her mother, Julia Connor, may have died at the hands of Holmes in December of 1891, and they were both named in his confession after he was arrested. Now, Julia Smythe Connor was married to her husband, Asilius Ned Connor, at the time that she met Holmes. Ned was an employee of Holmes who worked at the jewelry counter in his pharmacy, But once Julia met Holmes, the two began an affair that would result in Ned leaving Julia and Pearl. And then Julia and Pearl moved into Holmes' house. Soon after that, it's reported that Julia became pregnant with Holmes' child, and she insisted that they get married. But Holmes was actually already married at this point. His situation with his relationships and marriages is very complicated. Honestly, I don't know how he kept it all straight, but he would often have like several wives and girlfriends at a time that all did not know about each other. But he did agree to the marriage with the condition that he would perform an abortion on her. And it's not known if this was a plot for him to kill her or if she died accidentally during the abortion. Although, you know, I certainly would have put it past him to have killed her intentionally. Now, in his confession, Holmes apparently stated that Pearl was poisoned after this, but was a little bit more fuzzy on who actually poisoned her. He claimed that he gave Pearl to another family who poisoned her on his directions. He certainly would have had the motive to do it himself, though, because she would have been old enough to remember her mother's death and probably been able to give the police incriminating information. Another woman who supposedly met her end at Holmes Castle is Emmeline Cigrand. Emmeline Cigrand was born in 1868 in Tippecanoe, Indiana, and she was initially associated with Holmes as her employer. She actually moved to Chicago to work for him as his secretary, but she also eventually became his mistress. She may have signed over control of her assets to him at some point. Now, Holmes' stories to her family about what ultimately happened to her in 1892 were confusing and kept changing, but either she intended to leave and marry another man, or Holmes forced her to write a letter to her parents saying so. But in the end, she may have had information that would have been incriminating to Holmes, so he unfortunately trapped her in a vault in the castle and left her there to die. She would have been only 24 years old at the time. This is unconfirmed, but Holmes may have disposed of her remains by selling her skeleton to a medical school. Now, we see even more of Holmes' capacity to spin a yarn that will lessen his role in his own crimes in the case of the 1893 murders of sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams. In Holmes' version of events that was published in his autobiography, he transfers a lot of responsibility for his crimes onto Minnie Williams. According to Holmes, she was the one to romantically pursue him instead of the other way around. And while her sister Nanny visited Minnie and Holmes, Holmes claimed that Minnie had killed her sister in a fit of jealousy that Nanny was encroaching on Minnie's relationship with Holmes, and that he was only guilty of helping her dump the body in a lake. He would also claim that Minnie would go on to be responsible for some of his other murders that we'll discuss later on. In actuality, Holmes was the one who killed Nanny. He locked her in a giant safe in the house. Minnie was not responsible for her sister's death or any of the other murders that he had pinned on her. She was likely already dead by the time that the murders took place that he had pinned on her. In a later confession, Holmes admitted that he had Minnie sign her property over to him, and then he chloroformed her in her sleep and disposed of her remains in his cellar. In that confession, Holmes also claimed that he had killed Minnie and Nanny's brother, Baldwin. Before he had killed Minnie, he had taken out a life insurance policy on her brother, with her as the beneficiary. He supposedly later found Baldwin in what would later become Oklahoma and poisoned him. It's unknown exactly how many people were killed by H.H. Holmes, but one thing that we know for sure is that he was only ever prosecuted for one murder, the murder of Benjamin Pitezel in 1894. And one of the wildest things about this case is that for at least part of the scheme, Benjamin was in on it, Holmes and Benjamin had planned a life insurance scheme that would involve Holmes taking out a life insurance policy on Ben, with himself as the beneficiary, Ben faking his own death, and then Holmes collecting the insurance payout and splitting it with Ben. Now, unbeknownst to Ben, Holmes' version of the plan involved his death being not so faked. Now, the first part of Holmes' plan went off without a hitch, and with Ben dead, he collected the insurance money. The plan was not without its loose ends. However, during a previous stint in jail for a different fraud, Holmes had confided in a fellow inmate, Marion Hedgepath, about his plans for the scheme involving Pitezel. Hedgepath then informed the police about this plan, and Holmes' time was running out. Holmes would then have to go on the run because the police were on to him, and he was growing more paranoid at this point. He worried about Ben's children giving information to the police, so he went to Benjamin's wife, Carrie, who had no idea about the murder. She only knew about the insurance scheme, and she was under the impression that Ben was still alive and he had just faked his death for the insurance scheme. So Holmes convinced her to let him travel with 3 of their 5 children, and sadly he did also kill these 3 of Ben's children, most likely by poisoning them. After being on the run for weeks, Holmes was finally arrested in November of 1894. He never actually gave a straight answer for how many people he had killed, and we had constantly changed the stories he gave to police. The only real number we have from him is 27, but the actual total could be much lower, much higher. Between the amount of speculation after the fact that people did, and the fact that Holmes is absolutely the kind of person who would inflate the number of people he had killed to sound quote-unquote more impressive, it's unlikely that we'll ever know the true number. Holmes was convicted for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel and sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out on May 7th, 1896. He was 34 years old. Seeing as how it's been over a century since Holmes' death, and he is considered to be America's first serial killer, there's been a lot of time for him to take on an almost mythological quality. A lot of the details of this case are unknown or have been lost to time, so it's easier for people to fill in the blanks and sensationalize aspects of the story. Now, some of the sensationalism even came from the newspapers of the time. They took a lot of Holmes' statements at face value or even exaggerated them. I found this particularly dramatic headline from the Philadelphia Inquirer, who published the details of his confession. This was on Sunday, April 12th, 1896. Let me give you my best dramatic reading. Here we go. Holmes confesses 27 murders, the most awful story of modern times, told by the fiend in human shape. Every detail of his fearful crimes told by the man who admits he is turning into the shape of the devil, the tale of the greatest criminal in history. We now know that a lot of the tales that were told about Holmes after his death might have had more of a mythologizing quality, and certainly trusted Holmes' account of his crimes way too much. And if y'all would like me to, I would also love to make a video about people who were definitely not killed by H.H. Holmes, including people he named in his confession that were actually still alive, as well as people who never existed. He just completely made them up to tell stories about murders that never happened. My personal favorite theory that has come up in the century since this, purely because of how ridiculous it is a theory that suggests that Jack the Ripper was actually H.H. Holmes. I kind of find it funny that people form theories like this and treat it like a serial killer MCU or something. I remember reading a book about this. It's called The American Ripper Theory. I read this ages ago. I found it very hard to believe, but fun to read. So if y'all would like to see a video about the American Ripper theory as well, please let me know. I would also like to do a video on Jack the Ripper also. And since that case is still unsolved, there is a lot we could explore there. There's a lot of theories. Now, Holmes has also inspired a number of fictionalized portrayals, including the character that's the basis for the hotel season of American Horror Story. I would also love to do a video on characters or storylines in American Horror Story that are inspired by actual events, so definitely let me know if you'd like to see that as well. So that's the story of H.H. Holmes. If you have any questions or other topics associated with this case, please do let me know, and I can make a follow-up video addressing them. Coming up next, I'll be posting more of my playthrough of Famicom Detective Club, The Missing Heir, as well as most likely a deep dive into Jack the Ripper, or one of the other topics I mentioned in this video. So I will see y'all then. Thanks for watching.